Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a night of singular dreariness that this curious adventure commenced, one of those relentless autumn evenings where the London rain descends not in fierce sheets, but in a thin, insistent drizzle, soaking through coat and spirit alike. Within the familiar walls of 221B Baker Street, the mood was scarcely brighter. Holmes had passed the day in profound and, to my eye, dangerous idleness, lounging first upon the settee, then at the window, and finally sprawled across his armchair with a languor that concealed the restless workings of his formidable mind. He had spoken little since luncheon, save to mutter some contemptuous remark about a particularly banal scandal occupying the headlines. I had come to recognize this mood, knowing it to be the storm's calm before some singular case would inevitably blow through our door. And so, when Mrs. Hudson's tread approached, my heart quickened with anticipation. As I set aside the pages of the Strand, my attention was drawn to Holmes himself. He sat cross-legged, holding a large, crinkled sheet upon his knee, a map, yellowed with age, and bearing the unmistakable hand of an ancient cartographer. "Charing Cross," he said absently, noting my gaze. "Purchased this morning for 6pence. "A curiosity?" I inquired. "Purely." He tossed it aside with studied indifference, though I could not help but notice his fingers lingered upon its edge. Holmes's curiosities had a peculiar habit of becoming, within hours, matters of some urgency to the peace of the realm. The conversation was cut short by the sudden sharp rap of knuckles upon the downstairs door. The sound, though commonplace enough, carried with it a certain hesitancy, as though the hand that struck had little confidence in the reception it might receive. Holmes's head lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring like a hound scenting the air. The knock came again, and through the rain-blurred window I discerned the shadowed outline of a tall figure, gaunt and stooping, poised uncertainly upon our doorstep. "Interesting," murmured Holmes, already rising. "I believe the storm has finally brought us a diversion." Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose appearance would, under brighter circumstances, have drawn immediate comment. His coat, though once of fine wool, was now threadbare and spattered with mud. He clutched, as though it were a lifeline, a small leather-bound journal whose corners were softened by years of handling. The man's face, pale and drawn, was framed by hair prematurely grey, and his hands, nervous, twitching things, moved ceaselessly across the surface of his coat. His eyes, flickering from Holmes to myself and back again, carried the unmistakable weight of fear mingled with desperation. Holmes's gaze swept over our visitor with the swift precision I had come to expect, yet still marvelled at. Before the man could utter so much as his name, Holmes began to speak, his tone light, but his words incisive. "You have come directly from the reading room at the British Museum, where you spent several hours poring over antiquarian registers, though with little success. You travelled here on foot from Charing Cross, though the last portion of your journey was hurried, judging by the fresh mud upon your left instep. The journal you clutch is no doubt an heirloom, and judging by the ink smudge upon your thumb, you have been adding to it within the last hour." The man's mouth opened and closed in astonishment, while I could not suppress a smile. Holmes, it seemed, had found his case. "Please," said Holmes, "be seated. Your story, I suspect, will not lack for interest." The man lowered himself into the armchair opposite Holmes, with the air of one accustomed to heavier burdens than mere fatigue. His long fingers trembled slightly as he placed the worn journal upon his knee, and I observed, with some curiosity, the peculiar stains along its edges. Ink, certainly, but mingled with something darker, perhaps oil or candle grease. My name, he began in a voice at once educated and anxious, is Algernon Wade. My profession, though some might call it an obsession, lies in the study of London's ancient past, its vanished streets, buried relics, and the histories long forgotten beneath its stones. Holmes inclined his head fractionally, his fingertips pressed together in silent invitation for the man to continue. There was, even then, a gleam of interest in my friend's sharp eyes, though he betrayed nothing beyond polite indifference. Perhaps you have heard, Wade said, his fingers curling around the journal's spine, of the so-called lost treasure of London. Holmes, predictably, made no response, though I saw his brows lift by the smallest degree. It is said that when the Great Fire of 1666 swept through the city, certain learned societies, groups of antiquarians, scholars, and even alchemists, took desperate measures to preserve their most valuable relics and documents. In the confusion, these treasures were hidden beneath the ruins of ancient buildings, sealed away within vaults whose locations were known only to a handful of trusted men. He opened the journal, revealing pages crammed with angular handwriting and rough sketches of maps. This record belonged to my grandfather, who dedicated his life to tracing the treasure's true location. Recently, I came to believe I had found the final clue, only for the journal's most vital page, the map itself, to vanish from my locked study. Stolen? I asked. Wade nodded grimly. And I fear, gentlemen, that its thief understands its significance far too well. Your grandfather, said Holmes, at last breaking his silence. He was part of this secret fraternity? To my knowledge, yes, Wade replied, though he rarely spoke of it directly. I grew up in his house, surrounded by books, maps, and strange symbols I did not understand. Only after his death did I begin to grasp their meaning. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture that spoke of long hours spent wrestling with unsolved puzzles. The key, the literal key to one of these vaults, was kept among his personal effects. I inherited it, along with his journals. But 2 nights ago my study was broken into. The lock was forced, and the key, along with the journal's final page, was taken. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Taken, but not the journal itself. Exactly, Wade said. Whoever did this knew precisely what to look for. Curious, murmured Holmes. A thief with rather specialized tastes. Wade hesitated before speaking again, his gaze flickering toward the window, as if fearful his words might summon some unseen spectre. There is a man, he said quietly. Professor Felix Dunworthy, a rival in my field, though rivalry hardly captures the depth of his animosity. Dunworthy, said Holmes, his tone devoid of emotion. The name is familiar. As well it might be, Wade said bitterly. He has made a career of appropriating the work of others, often embellishing his thefts with forgeries so ingenious they deceive even seasoned historians. We have crossed swords more than once. And you believe him capable of burglary? Wade gave a weary shrug. If he suspected I had found the final clue, I would put nothing past him. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. I knew from experience that his mind was already several steps ahead. Holmes rose abruptly, crossing the room to stand before Wade, his gaze travelling from the man's mud-spattered boots to the ink-stained cuff of his left sleeve. You spent last night at St. Paul's Crypt, where you hoped to corroborate some detail in your grandfather's notes. You took the Northern Line to Charing Cross this morning, and I would hazard that you visited Scotland Yard before coming here, though you left without satisfaction. Wade's jaw slackened in astonishment. How could you possibly know? The clay upon your boots is distinctive to the grounds beside the cathedral, particularly after rain. The ink on your sleeve is mixed with the red sealing wax favoured by the archivist at St. Paul's. As for the yard, the faint odour of stale pipe smoke clings to your coat, a memento, I would suggest, of the waiting room reserved for the public. Wade glanced down at his sleeve as though seeing it for the first time. I was turned away, he admitted. The officer on duty seemed uninterested in tales of lost treasure. "Most unfortunate," said Holmes, returning to his chair. "But happily you have come to the right place." For a moment, silence settled over the room, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Holmes's fingers against his knee. "Treasure," he said at last. A word designed to engage the imagination of every schoolboy and half the criminals in London. Ordinarily, I would dismiss such tales as fanciful relics of folklore. Wade's expression faltered, but Holmes continued. "And yet," he said, "the precision of your account, the theft of a single page, the curious restraint shown by the intruder, these are not the hallmarks of common housebreakers. No, Mr. Wade, you have not brought us a story of treasure. You have brought us a story of obsession." He leaned back, a rare smile touching his lips, which, as it happens, is infinitely more interesting. When Wade had gone, leaving behind his journal and an air of mounting unease, I turned to Holmes. "Do you truly believe there's any substance to this treasure legend?" I asked. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze drifting toward the rain-smeared window. "The treasure itself does not interest me," he said. "What fascinates me is the mind willing to steal for it." "You mean Dunworthy?" "Perhaps." He stood abruptly. "Or perhaps someone closer to Mr. Wade than he imagines. There is a certain scent to this case, my dear Watson, a scent I have not encountered since our affair with the Musgrave ritual." There was a glint in his eye, the unmistakable spark of a hunter who has caught the scent of prey. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but within the warm confines of Baker Street, the game had already begun. I confess, upon our arrival at Mr. Wade's residence, I felt an instant kinship with the overburdened house itself. It was a dwelling more library than home. Shelves bowed under the weight of manuscripts, stacks of maps leaned precariously against the walls, and every available surface seemed to groan beneath the weight of crumbling books and brittle papers. There was scarcely room to sit, let alone to walk, without brushing against some relic of England's ancient past. Holmes navigated this sea of paper with the ease of a man crossing familiar ground, his hands flitting from object to object, pausing only when some detail caught his eye. I observed his sharp glance toward a glass cabinet whose lock had been forced, then to the floor, where a jagged ink stain trailed across the carpet like a dark signature. "Chaos," murmured Holmes, though there was a glint in his eye that told me this was precisely the kind of ordered chaos he relished. Wade, trailing behind us, wrung his hands anxiously, his every step a silent apology for the disorder we surveyed. It was, I realized, a house drowning not only in history, but in secrets yet untold. Holmes began his examination without ceremony, his gaze darting from corner to corner with the restless precision of a hawk. Wade hovered, eager to assist, but Holmes's silence rendered any interruption unthinkable. I took up my accustomed post, at the edge of the room, notebook in hand, attempting to anticipate the sequence of deductions I knew would shortly unfold. The lock on the cabinet had been forced with an unusual implement, leaving a series of gouges that Holmes traced with his forefinger. A broken ink bottle lay discarded nearby, its contents staining not only the carpet, but a length of twine that had been hastily swept beneath the desk. "A clumsy entry," Holmes muttered, half to himself. Not the work of a professional cracksman, but someone driven by urgency rather than skill. He bent low, inspecting the window latch, which hung loosely from its frame. And an exit equally haphazard. He straightened. Our intruder knew precisely what he sought, and wasted no time obtaining it. No misplaced curiosity. No rifling of drawers. He came with a single purpose. "And that purpose?" I asked. Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. "That, my dear Watson, is the very heart of our inquiry." Holmes instructed Wade to retrieve any papers his grandfather had left relating to the lost treasure. The man returned moments later, his arms overflowing with folders, brittle letters, and hand-drawn charts. Holmes sorted through them with the deftness of a card sharp, discarding irrelevant documents without a second glance. It was not long before he came upon a letter, dated half a century earlier, written in a firm, angular hand. The seal bore a strange device, a serpent entwined around a key. Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "This," he said, holding the letter aloft, "is far more illuminating than any map." The letter spoke in veiled terms of a brotherhood formed centuries earlier, a secret society of scholars sworn to protect relics deemed too dangerous or valuable to enter public hands. Their knowledge passed orally, their records encrypted within innocuous texts, maps of London that doubled as keys to hidden vaults. The society, it seemed, had dissolved in scandal and recrimination. And yet, Holmes observed, its legacy persists. Someone knew precisely where to look, someone who knew the story as intimately as your grandfather himself. Wade blanched. But who? "Patience," said Holmes. "We shall know soon enough." Holmes sat upon a pile of books, hands tented, eyes half-lidded in thought. His deductions, when they came, flowed with the gentle inevitability of rain upon a window pane. "This was no ordinary burglary," he began. "The precision of the theft, one document taken, no valuables disturbed, speaks to a mind with intimate knowledge of this house and its contents. Such knowledge could only belong to someone once trusted with that knowledge. And trust, once broken, often curdles into resentment." He turned to Wade. "You mentioned an estranged brother." Wade flinched. "Horace. But that's impossible. We haven't spoken in years." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Estrangement leaves behind not merely absence, but wounds. Wounds that fester, particularly when one brother inherits the legacy the other believes is his birthright." I confess this turn astonished me. "You deduce all this from a broken lock and a missing page?" Holmes gestured to the forced cabinet. "This was no common burglar, Watson. This was a man who knew exactly where to find the map, knew exactly how to enter, and knew the value lay not in gold, but in knowledge denied him." He stood. "Come, Watson. The trail, though faint, is growing warmer." Holmes paused suddenly, his sharp gaze fixed upon the surface of Wade's battered desk. There, smeared across the wood near the broken lock, was a small but unmistakable streak of yellowish wax. Holmes leaned closer, his nostrils twitching slightly, as though scent could confirm what sight had already revealed. "This," he murmured, "is quite delicious." "Wax?" I asked, not for the first time struggling to follow his leap of logic. "Not just wax, Watson, but a rare blend containing traces of camphor and lavender oil, a concoction produced only by a certain candle maker off Lehman Street in Whitechapel." He straightened, his eyes glinting with that particular light that always preceded a revelation. "This candle maker's clients are, by and large, not the sort who favour polite company. His trade lies in supplying those who work by night, forgers, tomb robbers, and dealers in less than legal antiquities." I could not help but marvel at the precision of the deduction, born from a single smear. "Whoever broke into this house," Holmes concluded, "frequents that shop. Which means, Watson, that the path ahead of us runs directly into the underbelly of London's oldest vice, the theft and sale of history itself." As ever, I found myself simultaneously impressed and infuriated by the ease with which Holmes leapt from clue to conclusion. It was a sensation I had grown accustomed to over the years, yet never fully reconciled. He made the rest of us, even those of sound professional sense, feel as though we were fumbling in the dark. "Do you mean to say," I began, "that you identified not only the composition of the wax, but the very establishment that supplied it, from a smear no larger than a coin?" Holmes allowed himself a faint smile, the sort one might wear upon solving a minor puzzle over breakfast. "My dear Watson, had you ever troubled to examine the candles upon our own mantelpiece, you would have recognized it at once. I have used the very same shop for years, though for rather more innocent purposes." His humour, as usual, was dry as sandpaper, and yet I found myself unable to resent it. There was a certain artistry to Holmes's deductions, a performance of intellect which, however humbling to witness, carried a brilliance I could not help but admire. "It is a rare pleasure," he added, "to stumble upon an old acquaintance in the course of fresh crime." Holmes stood, brushing the dust from his coat with brisk efficiency, and cast a glance at Wade, who had been observing the exchange with the glassy-eyed bewilderment of a man watching a game played in a language not his own. "Mr. Wade," Holmes said, "I trust you will forgive our absence this evening. There is a particular conversation I wish to have with the candlemaker, and I fear your presence would add nothing but unnecessary caution to his manner." Should I accompany you?" Wade stammered, though it was clear the prospect held little appeal. "Decidedly not," Holmes replied. "You are far better employed remaining here, cataloguing precisely what else may be missing from your grandfather's collection. I would pay particular attention to documents concerning your brother." His tone was mild, but the emphasis was deliberate. "Horace?" Wade paled. "You surely don't think—" "All I think, Mr. Wade, is that fraternal resentment can be a far greater spur to crime than mere greed. And I would like to know precisely what knowledge Horace Wade might already possess." Without further explanation, Holmes caught up his coat and hat, his entire manner transformed from languor into decisive motion. I had seen it before, the moment the scent of the hunt became tangible. I hastened to follow, leaving Wade stammering his protests behind us. Outside, the rain had slackened, but the evening was no less dark. Holmes walked briskly, his long strides cutting through puddles without care. "We are not merely hunting a thief, Watson," he said as we strode toward Whitechapel. "We are descending into the world of men who trade not in gold or jewels, but in history itself. And as you well know, my dear fellow, history is a dangerous thing." We set out early the following morning for the modest home of Professor Felix Dunworthy, the man Wade had so confidently named as his academic adversary and suspected thief. I confess I had expected something rather more grand from so notorious a figure in the world of antiquarian circles. But the small, ivy-choked house on a quiet street in Bloomsbury had an air more of faded scholarship than villainy. Holmes, ever unwilling to knock where observation would serve, stood for a moment at the gate, his gaze tracing the uneven wear upon the doorstep, the letterbox long jammed with circulars, and the absence of ash in the chimney. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, you may do the honours." I had scarcely raised my hand to knock when the door creaked open to reveal a middle-aged woman in mourning dress, her red-rimmed eyes betraying recent loss. "Professor Dunworthy?" I inquired. The woman shook her head. "My husband died last month," she said softly. "If this is about his papers, I fear you are too late." Holmes offered a slight bow. "On the contrary," he said, "I believe we are precisely on time." Once inside, the widow led us to a sitting room cluttered with the relics of a life spent in scholarly obsession. Books stacked in precarious towers, papers shoved into every available corner. It was a sight not unlike Wade's own chaotic study, though tinged with the hush of recent mourning. "I do not know if this will assist you," the widow said, producing a small envelope from a side table. "My husband wrote this shortly before his death. I have not had the heart to read it." Holmes accepted the letter with the gravity such moments demanded, but I noticed the familiar gleam in his eye, the thrill of the chase overtaking any sentimentality. He broke the seal and unfolded the trembling script within. The letter was half confession, half warning. Dunworthy admitted to an unhealthy fascination with the legend of the lost treasure, a fascination that had drawn him into correspondence with a shadowy associate who claimed to possess the final key to its location. This associate, Dunworthy confessed, was no antiquarian at all, but a man driven not by scholarly interest, but by a personal vendetta, a man named Horace Wade. Holmes handed the letter to me without comment, but his smile was unmistakable, the satisfaction of a puzzle piece snapping into place. Holmes's next move was made with his usual ruthless efficiency. Upon returning to Baker Street, he disappeared into his bedroom only to emerge minutes later transformed into a figure so convincingly disreputable, I was forced to do a double take. Gone was the austere figure of the detective. In his place stood a hunched and grubby relic hunter, his coat tattered, his hands stained with what appeared to be lampblack, and a faint scent of gin clinging to him like a fog. "Watson," he said, adjusting a frayed scarf, "you will accompany me only as far as the door. This next step is best taken alone." Before I could object, we were already in a hansom cab rattling towards the East End. Our destination, as Holmes explained along the way, was a certain clandestine auction house where stolen relics changed hands with remarkable frequency. To enter as Sherlock Holmes would be to invite silence. To enter as a broken-down scavenger desperate for a quick profit was to become invisible. I stood outside in the bitter wind as Holmes slipped through the warped doorway without a backward glance. There are few moments in my life I recall with more unease than that half-hour wait, wondering if I would see my friend again, or if the shadows of London's underworld would swallow him whole. When Holmes re-emerged, his expression was one of cold satisfaction. His disguise was still intact, but there was a particular sharpness in his gaze, the look of a man who had found precisely what he came for. "Success?" I asked. "Partial," he replied, "but sufficiently illuminating." As we walked, Holmes relayed the fruits of his infiltration. Within the smoke-choked confines of the auction house, he had blended effortlessly into the throng, a gathering of petty thieves, disreputable dealers, and fortune-seekers willing to buy history by the ounce. Amidst the usual parade of pilfered curios, one item had drawn whispered attention: a fragment of ancient parchment, rumoured to be part of the very map Wade had described. The seller, Holmes learned, was operating under a false name, but his identity was betrayed by the smallest of details: the peculiar way he handled the parchment, folding it with the reverence of a man handling his own birthright. "Horace Wade," I murmured. "Indeed," said Holmes. "A man who has spent his life believing himself robbed of his inheritance, and who now seeks to reclaim it, piece by piece." He hailed another cab, his tone almost playful. "Come, Watson, it appears this is no longer a simple matter of theft. This, my dear fellow, is a family feud written in ink and sealed with wax." As our cab rattled back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat with his eyes half closed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, that familiar posture which told me his mind was already far ahead of the rest of us. It was not until we reached the firelit comfort of our sitting room that he spoke, his voice light but edged with certainty. "There is no need to chase further ghosts, Watson," he said. "The hand that stole from Algernon Wade's study, the voice that lured Professor Dunworthy into obsession, the shadow-selling fragments of a map, they all belong to one man." "And that man?" I asked, though I could already sense where the deduction led. "Horace Wade," Holmes said simply, "the estranged brother, a man once trusted, now discarded, a forger of documents so skillful that even reputable antiquarians were fooled. His exile from the family was not merely a personal disgrace. It was the moment he resolved to claim for himself the legacy he believed stolen." I confess, the revelation startled me, though it should not have. The theme of broken trust had been woven through the case from the start, yet the cold finality with which Holmes pronounced it, as though stating a law of nature, left me momentarily speechless. "He knows the treasure's worth," Holmes continued, "but more importantly, he knows what it represents: vindication, revenge, and proof that his talents were never inferior to his brother's." I could only marvel once again at Holmes's unfailing clarity. Holmes paced as he spoke, his voice weaving a story more tragic than criminal. The tale of two brothers once inseparable, now locked in a silent war over history itself. "Horace Wade," he began, "was once his brother's closest confidant. Together they rummaged through their grandfather's library, deciphering ancient codes, tracing long-forgotten histories across the city. But Horace's talents lay not merely in scholarship, they lay in creation, in the subtle manipulation of fact to suit fiction. He could make a map appear older than its paper, a letter seem written by a hand centuries dead. Holmes paused by the window, his silhouette dark against the rain. When Algernon discovered one such forgery, a document so convincing it nearly misled the British Museum itself, the bond was broken. Horace was cast out, disowned, his work dismissed as trickery. And it was at that moment, Watson, that he became dangerous. I listened, spellbound, as Holmes continued. For years, Horace lived in the shadows, consorting with dealers and thieves, learning their tricks and perfecting his own. But always, his mind circled back to the treasure, not for its value, but for the chance to rewrite the family's story with himself as its rightful heir. There was, I thought, a grim poetry to it. A man forging not just documents, but his own legacy, one deception at a time. I had expected Holmes to show his usual detached satisfaction at solving the heart of the mystery, but instead, he turned to me with a gravity that I could not mistake. "This is no longer a mere burglary," he said. "It is no longer about treasure or secrets alone. Family betrayal is a venomous thing, Watson. It poisons reason, blinds judgment, and compels even the most rational man to acts of folly." I found myself unsettled by his tone. Holmes was no stranger to human frailty, but there was a particular sharpness in his voice when family and history became entwined. He had always held sentiment in some contempt, yet I had seen on rare occasions that its destructive power fascinated and repelled him in equal measure. "Mark me well, Watson," he said. "We have not yet reached the bottom of this well. Horace Wade's theft was not the end. It was only the opening move in a far more dangerous game." "And what lies at the bottom?" I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. "We shall know soon enough." Holmes dropped into his chair, his fingers once more steepled, his gaze fixed upon the flames dancing in the hearth. It was the posture of a man constructing a trap, not from ropes and snares, but from words, whispers, and the weight of his own reputation. "Our adversary," he said, "believes himself clever. That, Watson, is our greatest advantage." I knew well this side of Holmes, the architect of psychological traps, the man who played upon the vanity and fear of others as a violinist plays upon strings. I watched as he began to draft a letter, every word carefully chosen, every phrase calculated to strike precisely at Horace Wade's deepest fear, the fear of irrelevance. "We shall let it be known," Holmes continued, "that a fragment of the treasure map, one believed lost to history, will be displayed at the British Museum's next private showing." "And you think he will come for it?" I asked. "I do not think, Watson. I know." He smiled, a smile without warmth, without humour, the smile of a hunter who had set the bait and needed only to wait. Holmes's method for drawing his quarry into the open was, as always, a curious blend of simplicity and audacity. He lit his pipe, settled into his armchair, and with the air of a man dictating an invitation to tea, outlined the particulars of his plan. "We shall make use," he began, "of the single weakness common to all men of scholarly obsession, vanity. Horace Wade believes himself cleverer than his brother, cleverer than the scholars who rejected him, and certainly cleverer than us. The surest way to lure such a man is to present him with an opportunity to prove it." I watched as Holmes sketched out the bait with the precision of a man laying a chess trap 4 moves ahead. A whispered rumour, circulated through the proper channels, would suggest that a newly discovered fragment of the very map Horace sought was to be displayed at a forthcoming private exhibition at the British Museum. This fragment, Holmes suggested, would contain clues so tantalizing that no serious antiquarian could resist viewing it. "And of course," Holmes said, with a sardonic twist of his mouth, "our imaginary fragment will bear just enough resemblance to Horace's own forgery to convince him it must be recovered, or destroyed." I could not help but smile at the sheer elegance of it. Holmes was not simply setting a trap. He was inviting his adversary into a duel of intellect and ego, a contest where the prize was not the treasure itself, but the satisfaction of being the cleverest man in the room. The rumour spread precisely as Holmes predicted, not in a blaze, but in a series of soft, insidious whispers that wound their way through London's antiquarian circles like smoke through a keyhole. Holmes dispatched a series of brief, carefully composed letters to select booksellers, auctioneers, and minor historians, each containing some tantalizing reference to the map fragment and its imminent display. Within hours, the city's collectors were buzzing with speculation. Who had discovered this fragment? Why had the museum chosen to display it so discreetly? What secrets did it hold? The more questions the rumour provoked, the more irresistible it became. Holmes watched the unfolding drama with the quiet satisfaction of a spider testing the tautness of his web. By the following afternoon, we received the first proof that our bait had been taken. A query, delivered to a trusted intermediary, asking whether private viewings might be arranged for those with a particular scholarly interest in lost London maps. "And the author of this delicate inquiry?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "The handwriting is disguised naturally, but the use of a particular Latin phrase, one we found in Wade's grandfather's journals, leaves no doubt. Horace Wade has taken the bait." There was in Holmes's voice no trace of triumph. To him, the success was not in ensnaring the man, but in the perfection of the mechanism itself, the subtle machinery of deceit that had led our adversary precisely where Holmes intended. The British Museum, lit for evening, possesses a character altogether different from its daylight incarnation. By day, it is a temple to knowledge. By night, it becomes something closer to a vault of secrets, each artifact casting long shadows, each case concealing some fragment of forgotten history. Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Lestrade arrived amidst a subdued but unmistakably eager crowd of collectors, scholars, and those dilettantes who haunt such events more from vanity than curiosity. I confess that, despite the gravity of our purpose, I found myself momentarily swept up in the atmosphere. The rustle of evening coats, the murmur of learned speculation, and the faint scent of old paper combined into a perfume unlike any other. Holmes, as ever, stood apart, his sharp gaze skimming the room, his mind detached from the social theatre playing out around him. Lestrade, by contrast, wore the uneasy expression of a man thrust into alien surroundings, his boots squeaking audibly on the polished floor. "Keep your eyes on the entrances," Holmes murmured. "Our man will enter cautiously, perhaps even twice, to reassure himself. He will not approach the case directly at first. A forger knows better than to behave like a thief." I knew better than to ask how Holmes could be so certain. His understanding of criminal psychology often seemed less deduction than divination, a gift he wore not with pride, but with the calm inevitability of a man who had simply trained himself to see what others could not. It was I who first noticed him, a figure tall but stooped, moving through the room with the uneasy gait of a man at war with his own nerves. His coat, though fine, hung oddly upon his frame, as if its fit had been altered hastily. His gloves were too large, his hat brim too low, a disguise assembled by someone who understood the theory, but lacked the artistry. Holmes, standing beside me, gave the faintest nod. "Observe the hands, Watson," he murmured. "Even in gloves, the fingers betray their habits." I looked closer and saw it, the repeated flick of the right thumb against the side of the index finger, a gesture Wade himself had made no fewer than 6 times in our first interview. It was a tick born of long years spent turning pages and handling fragile paper, a signature as distinct as handwriting. Holmes allowed him to circulate the room, his progress slow and deliberate, pausing here and there to inspect irrelevant displays. It was a performance for our benefit, a pantomime of innocent curiosity. But Holmes's smile, cold, razor-thin, told me the performance had failed. "The next move," Holmes whispered, "is ours." We had not long to wait before the trap sprung itself. The disguised figure, his movements cautious but purposeful, drifted ever closer to the locked display case at the far end of the room. There was a curious tension to his manner, the studied nonchalance of a man performing a role he had rehearsed many times in his mind, but which the presence of too many eyes had rendered suddenly fragile. He paused, feigning interest in a nearby exhibit, but his hand, gloved and trembling, drifted toward his pocket, no doubt testing the feel of some hidden tool within. It was then that Holmes stepped forward, so silently and naturally that I confess even I started at his sudden presence beside the case. "Good evening," Holmes said, his voice low but unmistakably clear. The man stiffened, turning only halfway before Holmes continued. "I trust you have found the exhibition to your liking, Mr. Wade." The hand dropped from his pocket as though scorched. The half-turned face remained shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but the shape of the mouth, thin and drawn, betrayed both shock and recognition. Holmes, his expression one of almost paternal amusement, gestured toward the case. It would be a shame, would it not, if such a remarkable fragment were to vanish into private hands before the world could enjoy it? The man said nothing, but I saw the brief flicker of calculation in his eyes, measuring the door, the distance to freedom, and the towering obstacle of Sherlock Holmes between the two. Holmes did not move from his place beside the case, nor did his voice rise above the level of polite conversation. And yet, as he spoke, every head within earshot turned, drawn as much by the authority of his tone as by the quiet drama it contained. "It is remarkable," he began, "how swiftly a trail can be followed once one understands the shape of the footsteps." He folded his arms, addressing neither the crowd nor the man directly, but some invisible jury composed of reason and fact. "When I first examined the study at Mr. Wade's house, the nature of the theft itself was most illuminating. A thief who ignores silver and valuables, who takes only a single document and a small iron key. This is no common burglar. This is a man with knowledge so precise that it can only come from within the family itself." His eyes flicked toward the man, whose head now hung slightly lower. "From there, it was a matter of tracing wax to Whitechapel, a whisper to an auction hall, and a forged letter to a dying man. Each clue, taken alone, might have led nowhere, but together they form a chain as unbreakable as iron." Holmes stepped forward. "And at the end of that chain stands Horace Wade, the scholar turned forger, the brother turned thief, the man who has pursued his family's secrets, not for their value, but for the bitter satisfaction of proving himself cleverer than the brother who cast him out." There was silence when Holmes finished, save for the soft intake of breath from the accused himself. With the inevitability of a man who sees the walls closing in, Horace Wade drew himself up, shedding the feigned stoop and timidity of his disguise. There was something almost theatrical in his defiance, as though he had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind and was determined to deliver his final lines with flair. "You think you know everything," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "but you have only scratched the surface." He turned, addressing not just Holmes, but all within earshot. "The treasure of London. Do you imagine it is gold, jewels, baubles fit for children's tales?" He laughed, though the sound held no humour. "It is paper, gentlemen. Documents, letters, records that could ruin half the noble families of this city, scandals buried for generations, secrets of birth and betrayal, things men would kill to protect." There was a murmur among the guests, scholars suddenly tasting something far more intoxicating than ancient maps or lost coins. Holmes's expression did not shift. "And you, naturally, planned to sell these secrets to the highest bidder." "I planned," said Wade, his voice growing sharper, "to show my brother, and all of you, that I am not the black sheep of my family. I am the keeper of its truest history." It was, I reflected, both confession and epitaph. If Horace Wade expected his revelation to shake Holmes, he was swiftly disabused of the notion. Holmes merely gave a slight, almost regretful shake of the head. "It is a pity," he said, "that you wasted so much ingenuity chasing shadows. Had you paused to consider, you might have realized that I had already taken steps to secure the documents in question." The sharp intake of breath from Horace was, I confess, a minor satisfaction. "I anticipated, you see, that your true target was never the map, but the records themselves. They were removed from their hiding place this morning and placed in the custody of Inspector Lestrade. They are now sealed in Scotland Yard's evidence room." Holmes's voice was almost gentle. "Whatever your grievances, Mr. Wade, the law shall be your only judge now." Horace's shoulders slumped, and for the first time I glimpsed not a villain or forger, but a man who had spent too long carrying the weight of his own bitterness until it crushed every better instinct he once possessed. There are few men more dangerous than those with nothing left to lose. Even as Holmes spoke, I saw Wade's hand shift toward his coat, and a glint of steel flashed beneath the cuff. Instinct drove me forward, though I was scarcely prepared for what followed. Wade lunged, his blade, a thin stiletto, scarcely longer than a pen, darting toward Holmes's unprotected chest. It was neither Holmes's speed nor my own that saved him, but a clumsy intervention on my part, my hand striking Wade's wrist at an awkward angle. We stumbled together, the blade scraping harmlessly along Holmes's sleeve before clattering to the floor. Wade struggled like a man possessed, strength born of desperation surging through him. It was only through sheer luck, and perhaps my old army training, that I managed to wrestle him into submission. Lestrade and his men converged, hauling Wade to his feet. My heart pounded, my breath ragged, and yet Holmes merely straightened his cuff, as calm as if he had been accosted by a stray cat, rather than a man armed with a knife. "Really, Watson," he said with the faintest smile, "you must remember to step aside and leave the heroics to me." As Lestrade led Horace Wade away, the subdued figure offered no further resistance. The fight, both literal and metaphorical, had drained from him entirely. "Will the documents truly remain sealed?" I asked Holmes as we stepped into the cool night air. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "For now. But secrets, like bodies, have a tendency to rise when least expected. There are men in this city for whom those papers would be worth any price." "And the treasure itself?" I asked. Holmes shrugged. "Treasure, Watson, is a matter of perspective. To some, it is gold. To others, truth. And to men like Horace Wade, it is nothing more than proof that they mattered." We walked in silence for a time, the rain beginning to fall once more. Holmes's pace was unhurried, his mind already, I suspected, turning toward the next case awaiting us at Baker Street. "Come along, Watson," he said at last. "I have a monograph on ancient ink composition I've been meaning to finish, unless, of course, you prefer to write our own scandalous account." He smiled, that rare, mischievous smile, and I knew that the adventure of the lost treasure of London had drawn to its end. It was close to midnight when Holmes and I ascended the familiar staircase to our sitting room at Baker Street, the rain having soaked us both to the skin. I, for my part, was in no mood for reflection, my nerves still frayed from the scuffle at the museum and the extraordinary revelations that had followed. Holmes, however, seemed wholly unaffected by the discomfort of wet clothes. His thoughts turned inward, his mind doubtless already composing the final notes of his own mental symphony. I stirred the fire into life and, with some irritation, watched Holmes calmly fill his pipe as though the evening had been nothing more than an exercise in routine. My patience, worn thin by both dampness and curiosity, gave way at last. "Holmes," I said, "you will not persuade me to bed until you have laid bare every step of this confounding case. You have treated me to fragments and flashes of your reasoning, but I insist, before this night is out, I must know the whole." Holmes, with the faintest trace of amusement, gestured to the armchair opposite. "Very well, Watson," he said, "though I cannot promise the tale will be as dramatic as your eventual account." Holmes leaned back, his pipe glowing faintly in the dim light, and began the story not at its climax, but at its origin, the so-called treasure map that had launched the affair. "The map, my dear Watson, was never a guide to gold or jewels," he said. "It was, in fact, something far more dangerous, a ledger." I must have looked puzzled, for Holmes elaborated. "A coded record, documenting not locations, but names. Names of men who belonged to a hidden brotherhood, Antiquarians and collectors who, under the guise of scholarship, formed a private society tasked with preserving and at times concealing certain historical relics deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. He tapped the ash from his pipe. Each man who joined the society was entrusted with a fragment of the whole, part map, part key, part confession. Over time, those fragments scattered, some lost, others deliberately hidden. Wade's grandfather, one of the last trusted members, took extraordinary precautions. His portion of the ledger was not kept as a document at all, but rather encrypted within the marginal notations of otherwise ordinary maps. "And the so-called treasure?" I asked. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "Secrets, Watson. Scandals, betrayals, suppressed histories, far more valuable than any chest of gold." I could only shake my head, astonished once more at how far reality had strayed from Wade's romantic notions. "But why?" I asked. "Would the old man go to such lengths? Surely if he wished to preserve the society's secrets, he could have entrusted them directly to his son." Holmes shook his head. "You assume, Watson, that trust flows naturally through blood. In reality, Algernon Wade's grandfather harbored profound doubts, not in the son who died young, but in the next generation. Horace Wade, though gifted, had already shown his hand as a forger by then. The old man suspected his ambition would outweigh his honor. But Algernon, the quieter, steadier brother, was deemed trustworthy, though not particularly brilliant. He gave the maps to Algernon, I asked. More precisely, he left them scattered throughout his personal library, knowing Algernon would inherit it. But the true brilliance lay in the concealment itself. Algernon believed the maps were mere curiosities. Only if he possessed both the maps and the knowledge of their marginal codes could the true meaning be unlocked. Holmes's fingers tapped softly against the arm of his chair. "The tragedy, Watson, is that Algernon never knew. His brother, cast out in disgrace, always suspected there was more to inherit than books and charts. That suspicion curdled into obsession, and from obsession into theft. I could not help but pity both men. One trusted too much, the other not at all." "And when," I asked, "did you begin to suspect the truth?" Holmes smiled, that maddeningly superior smile, which I had come to recognize as the hallmark of a deduction made long before I had grasped even the first thread. "From the very first mention of the Great Fire of 1666, he said. "When Wade tied his grandfather's research to the fire, I knew we were not dealing with treasure in the conventional sense. The fire is a favorite misdirection of amateur historians, a convenient event upon which to hang any number of half-truths." He relit his pipe. "Real treasure maps do not survive 3 centuries in London's damp libraries, nor are they conveniently divided into fragments like a child's puzzle. But a ledger, a living document, maintained and amended by successive hands, that was a far more plausible relic." He rose, pacing slowly. "It was not a treasure hunt we were embarking upon, Watson. It was a hunt for a man obsessed with proving himself cleverer than both his family and history itself. I could only marvel at the elegance of it, the way Holmes had unravelled the knot before the case had truly begun, and yet had allowed events to unfold precisely as they needed to." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not on me, but on some distant point beyond the room itself, a habit I knew well, reserved for those rare moments when even his detached intellect brushed against something almost emotional. "Horace Wade," he said quietly, "was never chasing gold." I waited, knowing Holmes never stated the obvious unless it led to something deeper. "Gold is a trifling thing, Watson. It buys only comforts. But history, that is true immortality. What Horace sought was not wealth, but revenge in its most academic form. He wished to unmask the society that had cast his grandfather into obscurity, to lay bare the secrets they had hoarded, the reputations they had built upon buried lies, and in so doing, to rewrite his own name into the very history that had erased him. There was, in Holmes's tone, the faintest trace of something resembling respect, a rare tribute to a mind deformed by bitterness but still capable of playing the long game. Men like Horace Wade do not crave gold, Holmes concluded. They crave legacy, a place not in a bank ledger but in the footnotes of history. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, the London rain streaking the glass like ink spilled upon a map. "Consider, Watson," he said, "how many fortunes in this city rest not upon what men own, but upon what they conceal." It was a sentiment I had rarely heard from Holmes, who often professed disdain for sentimentality of any kind. Yet here, in the soft gloom of Baker Street, it carried the weight of undeniable truth. "Empires are not built upon gold alone," he continued. "They are built upon knowledge, of who betrayed whom, of whose birth is less legitimate than the family crest proclaims, of which ancient pacts were sealed not by honor, but by blackmail." I shook my head. And this secret society, these guardians of history, they were no better than common conspirators. Holmes gave a thin smile. Their intentions were noble enough, I suspect. But noble intentions, like ancient maps, are easily stained by time. He turned back to the room, his expression unreadable. "London's greatest treasures, my dear Watson, have never glittered in the sunlight. They lie, still and patient, in ledgers and letters, waiting for men clever or desperate enough to unearth them." I leaned back in my chair, struck once again by the peculiar genius of my companion. "It astonishes me, Holmes," I said, "that you could deduce so much from so little. A smear of candle wax, a broken lock, the mention of a single fire centuries past." Holmes waved a hand, dismissing the compliment like a man shooing a fly. "Elementary," he said, with the dry amusement that so often left me torn between admiration and irritation. "You see, but you do not observe. The wax spoke of its maker, the lock spoke of its urgency, and the fire of 1666, that was the giveaway. No man invokes the great fire unless the secret he protects is as old as the ashes themselves." I could only shake my head. "And yet you allowed the case to play out, even after you knew the truth." "Of course," Holmes said with a shrug. "Knowing is nothing, Watson. Proving, that is the art." It was, I reflected, the eternal dance. Holmes moving always half a step ahead, revealing only what was necessary to keep the game alive. It was brilliance masquerading as simplicity, and simplicity hiding genius. I confess that even after all these years at Holmes's side, I remained both infuriated and fascinated by his methods. "It would save me considerable trouble," I said, "if you might, just once, explain your reasoning before the final curtain falls." Holmes smiled, that infuriating smile I had come to know too well. Where would be the sport in that? It was an old argument between us, one we relived with every case. To Holmes, deduction was not merely a means to an end. It was a performance, a demonstration of intellectual artistry meant as much for his own amusement as for justice. "You delight," I said, "in leaving me to stumble through the fog, only to produce the sun at the last moment and declare the day clear all along." Holmes's smile sharpened. "And yet you never fail to write it all down, from the first stumble to the final sunrise." I could only laugh, for it was true. My frustration with Holmes was matched only by my devotion to chronicling every twist of his remarkable mind. For all my grumbling, I knew well enough, without the fog, the sunrise would lose its splendor. Holmes filled his pipe, the ritual as much a part of his method as any magnifying glass or microscope. I watched as the smoke curled into the air, mingling with the faint scent of damp wool and ancient paper. "You will write this one up, I presume?" Holmes asked, though the question was unnecessary. "Of course," I said. "It is too remarkable a case to leave unrecorded." He gave a faint smile. "A word of advice, Watson. Embellish the treasure if you must, but be kind to the brothers. There is tragedy enough in their story without my particular cruelty laid bare. It was an unexpected moment of compassion from a man so often indifferent to sentiment, and it struck me that perhaps Holmes, for all his brilliance, understood bitterness more keenly than he ever let on. "And what of the society?" I asked. "Their secrets? Will they remain buried?" Holmes's smile returned, sharper this time. "Some secrets, Watson, deserve the dignity of dust. Others, however—" He held up a telegram that had arrived moments before. "Demand attention." The telegram lay open upon Holmes's knee, its message brief but sufficient to reignite the restless gleam in his eye. "Another case?" I asked. "An invitation," he corrected, "to a very peculiar auction in Surrey, where a certain Egyptian relic, long thought lost, has reappeared under suspicious circumstances." I sighed. "And you intend to accept, of course?" "Naturally," Holmes said. "The work of a detective, Watson, like the tide of the Thames, suffers no pause between one ebb and the next." He rose, already shedding the evening's case like an old coat, his mind turning toward the next puzzle with the hunger of a man who thrives not on answers, but on the chase itself. "And the lost treasure of London?" I asked. Holmes's smile was faint, but unmistakably triumphant. "It was never lost, Watson, merely misunderstood." And with that, he vanished into his room, leaving me with my notes, my admiration, and my perpetual frustration at being forever 2 steps behind the greatest mind I have ever known. The rain had not ceased when we returned to Baker Street, nor had the chill that seemed to cling to our coats long after we had discarded them. Holmes sat in his customary chair, his lean form drawn into itself, a coil of quiet energy held in temporary repose. The steady patter of rain against the glass provided a soft percussion to our silence, broken only by the faint crackle of his pipe as tendrils of blue smoke curled languidly toward the ceiling. I, too, had settled into my chair, though my mind remained restless, circling the events of the evening like a dog worrying at an old bone. Holmes, ever sensitive to the smallest shifts in atmosphere, glanced at me from beneath half-lowered lids. "There will be no epilogue, Watson," he said softly. "The curtain has fallen. Anything beyond this is merely embroidery." Yet I knew, even then, my pen would not be still. "Do you not wonder," I said at last, "how such a society first came to be? Who were these men, and what oath bound them so tightly that their secrets endured across generations?" Holmes gave a non-committal shrug, his attention apparently fixed on the slow spirals of his own smoke. "Some mysteries, Watson, thrive best when half-shrouded. The precise origins of this society will remain hidden, not because they are impenetrable, but because the men who kept them alive understood one vital truth." "And that is?" "That secrecy itself is power." I could not argue the point, though the romantic in me rebelled at the thought of leaving so many threads unpulled. Yet I knew Holmes well enough to recognize the limits of his curiosity. For him, the puzzle was only interesting, so long as it had utility. Once solved, it was discarded like a spent match. "I suspect," Holmes added, with a glance that carried the faintest glint of humor, "that your instincts will betray you in your write-up, Watson. You will dress these men in cloaks and shadows, weave oaths sworn in candlelight, and summon phantoms where only clerks and scholars once stood." "Perhaps," I admitted, "but you must allow me some artistic license." Holmes exhaled a ribbon of smoke, his smile dry. "As long as you understand that the romance exists only in your imagination. Reality, my dear fellow, is always more absurd, and far less poetic." Before I could offer my retort, the quiet of the room was broken by a soft but urgent knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice, tinged with curiosity and faint alarm, floated up the staircase. "A lady, doctor, in some distress." Holmes, his expression unchanged, merely raised an eyebrow. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hudson herself hovering on the threshold, and behind her stood a pale figure. A woman, slender to the point of frailty, her bonnet askew, her gloved hands trembling as they clutched a handkerchief stained a deep, unmistakable crimson. I turned back toward Holmes, but he was already rising. His interest peaked as surely as if a pistol had fired in the street below. "Show her in," he said quietly. "It appears, Watson, that London's secrets are not yet exhausted." The woman stepped inside, her voice faltering as she attempted to speak. Holmes, however, had no need of introductions. His gaze swept over her attire, her posture, the fading smudge of ink upon her cuff, and the curious wear along the hem of her skirt. Whatever tale she had come to tell, Holmes had already begun composing it for her. "The game," Holmes said, his smile barely perceptible, "is afoot." I reached instinctively for my notebook. That old reflex of chronicling born from long habit. Holmes caught the movement and, with the faintest nod, acknowledged the unspoken understanding between us, that while the case of the lost treasure of London had closed, the work of Sherlock Holmes would never truly end. It was, I thought, the nature of both man and city. London could no more cease generating mysteries than Holmes could resist pursuing them. And so, we began again. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the flickering fire casting shadows across the room. His long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not on me, but somewhere beyond the walls of Baker Street, lost in his own quiet contemplation. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said at last, "how often the true treasures of this city lie not in vaults or coffers, but in the minds of men who believe themselves forgotten." I looked up from my notes, unsure whether he was addressing me or merely thinking aloud. "This case," he continued, "was never about gold or jewels. It was about memory, the desperate need to be remembered not for what one possesses, but for what one leaves behind. Horace Wade did not steal a map, he stole a legacy. And like all thieves of history, he failed to understand that true legacies are not written by the hand of the thief, but by the voices of those who survive them." He tapped his fingers softly upon the armrest. "In the end, Watson, the most valuable treasures are not the ones men hide, but the ones they dare to reveal." As I closed my notebook, a question formed in my mind, one I now put to you, our curious audience. What do you think was Horace Wade's greatest mistake? Was it his forgery, his obsession with revenge, or something far more human, his refusal to trust his own brother? Share your theories in the comments below. Holmes himself would delight in hearing the deductions of sharp minds like yours. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery alongside us, be sure to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes adventures. Share this story with fellow lovers of detective fiction. And remember, the greatest mysteries are often hiding in plain sight. The game, as always, is afoot.